Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course Culturally Responsive Built Environments, and we are now at lecture 3. Here we are talking about habitus, a sense of place. So, following upon a little recapitulation of what we have discussed in our lecture 1 and lecture 2, we actually started with our discussion on how one can define place. And we moved on to the next session of place and identity, where we have discussed about various theoretical concepts. We also discussed about various philosophical positions. So one of the important concepts which we discussed is the Martin Heidegger's being in time. So Heidegger refers that places are constructed in our memories and affections through repeated encounters and complex associations. And he actually refers this whole process as a kind of workshop where we participate and where we deliberate and where we actually communicate to make our sense of belonging. So this is what the whole process is referred to as a dwelling. The dwelling is the capacity to achieve a spiritual unity between humans and the things. So what we can see here is it is how a man interacts with nature and how he produces his space and how it is again reproduced with his repeated interactions and how he tailors depending on his needs, depending on his daily living needs and the social needs, the cultural needs and the religious needs. So you can see here on the right hand side of houses in Kampong Plok in Cambodia. So you can see how people have developed their housing on stilts because of to protect themselves from the floods, or so they are trying to adjust themselves with the particular geographic surroundings. So they are trying to adjust with the nature. Today we are going to discuss about another important person in the debates of in the cultural understanding. So his name is Pierre Bourdieu, and one of his important contributions to the field of cultural studies is the habitus. He develops a concept of habitus, fields and games, and he is also the pioneer who actually started defining cultural capital. In fact, in his publication Logic of Practice, he discussed about a structural theory of practice which actually connects the structure and the agency. So structure here, I'm not talking about just the building structure. It is about how a society frames its own structure. And the whole discussion debate the relationships between the culture, the structure, and the power. Because power is, in the previous session also, we have discussed about the politics of identity. We discussed about Babri Masjid. We discussed about how power can influence. We also discussed about some good examples of how the modernism and the postmodernism, with an example of how a place like Chandigarh with the modernistic ideas, if would have been in a place like Riyadh, so the response would have been different. So, and though it is all translated from the French versions, French sociologist, so this is how he defines the habitus. Habitus is defined as a system of durable, transposable dispositions, structured structures, predisposed to function as structuring structures, that is, as principles which generate and organic practices and representations. Do you understand? I know this is a very difficult to understand for a person from architecture background because it's a very deeper understanding. I'll try to help you in simplifying this. In fact, after the death of Bourdieu, there's an important publication which actually was developed by a compilation work by Hiller and Rooksby in their book of Habitus, A Sense of Place, which actually they compiled a lot of work, especially from the built environment perspective, from an architectural perspective, from the planning perspective, from the anthropological perspective. So they brought different perspectives in it, different areas of studies, and how they have used Bourdieu's concept in their work. And not only using Bourdieu's work, how they have criticized it. So, in our earlier lecture, where we are talking about Martin Heidegger's work, Being in Time, and how the time gives its position, and at the same time, how we are also talking about the practices which we are developing in time. So, it is not only in time where you are situated, but it is also within the time how you are developing certain practices. So, Kim Dovey from Australia, he talks about habitus. It comprises of forms of habit and of habitat. So here, that repeated interactions and the kind of practice one is developing, he develops kind of he talks it as a forms of habit and how it makes it actually formulates a habitat. So it constructs both a sense of place and the sense of one's place in a social hierarchy. So now, in the traditional societies, let's say there's a feudal group of society living there, and there is a lower caste group living in a small hamlet. Obviously, a potter's society, they have certain livelihood practices. They are practicing their pottery in the banks of a river or in a hot sun. So that is how, according to their needs, how they develop certain habits in making pots, drying pots, and at the same time, the farmer is also taking and he's involved in the herding and the agricultural aspects. So each of them have started defining their roles and responsibilities, and that is how they demarcate themselves in a particular society. So here, Bourdieu refers to one of the important thing called field. So in a simpler terms, this is defined, a field then is a space of play within a network of objective relations between positions. So what are these positions? Now, for example, I am here. Now, I am from a society, from a small town in Andhra, a town called Nellore. So I am here. Who are associated with me is my family and my school. But over the years, I moved on to another place where I moved to Hyderabad, where I got a degree where I did architecture. And then I moved on to my for my postgraduate to Oxford. So in these all these whole 22 years of time, one has interacted, and there are certain sets of fields which I'm interacting with my hometown, the people there, and I'm practicing my customs, like on a Sankranti or a Pongal day, where traditionally we go to the burial ground and we share our ancestors' memories. So whereas in Hyderabad, so it has also I attained certain qualities of language. I learned some kind of slangs of language in order to accommodate within that particular customs. And the way the wedding is happened in Hyderabad, the way the weddings are happened in Nellore, they are slightly different. And whereas in Oxford, it is a very completely a different society. So I am creating my habitus. Now, in the same way, now I have work, I have my school, I have my family. So now I have a family. So now, here in my work, my rules are different. Here in Oxford, my rules and my conditions are different. Here in my hometown, my rules for freedom and my understanding of that place, the conditions are very different. So each field, we call it as each field, they have a different set of rules and conditions. Now, imagine here I performed well, here performed well, but imagine somewhere if I got a job in somewhere in ISIS or a war zone. Now my conditions, my abilities to perform all these activities, what I did here, it may not be the same, because the conditions, the constraints which I have are very different. So here we talk about these, how each field becomes different by its sets of rules. So these positions are objectively defined in the determinations they impose on actions and institutions by the situation, in the structure, in the distribution of powers. So what are these abilities? So if I want to talk about it, so now as I said, I have work, I have my home, and I have my place of a larger town, right? And there are different, maybe my school, all these things are which I have experienced in time. So now I have thing called capital, which is referred, this Bodio talks about the capital, which is it is the ability how one can manage his assets. It could be economic, it could be social, it could be natural, and it could be the physical. Apart from that, the most important thing is the cultural. So how, with all these assets, we call it as a capital, and which becomes a symbolic. It becomes a kind of symbolic capital, how you act here with the given conditions, and how you act here with the given conditions. So, but in this whole process, you can see that there will be some kind of overlap within your qualities, your abilities, how you are managing the things. So now you understand what is a field. So you can just imagine like it's a kind of playground. It's a cricket playground. Now you have set of rules. If you want a boundary, then it has to cross this line. If you have LBW, so all these set of rules, what to do and what not to do. So that field offers to you, and that game offers to you now a set of rules. Now, this habitus is subject to constant change. But such revisions are always based on existing social practices, which the habitat may change radically and the habitat gradually evolves. So now we talked about a field. This is the field. I'll tell you a small example. Now, if you are playing a game of a cricket and you have the boundary like this, so you play cricket. Maybe for 10 years, 15 years, you are playing a cricket. So players, who are we? We are all players playing cricket. Now, we learn from experience. It's like living is also like playing. It's a celebration. So we learn through our experience what is possible and what is not. So you always develop your strategies. Yes, if you want to bowl him, so you develop a strategy and you learn these rules, you learn these techniques, how to win the game, or how to manage it. So you learned how to work effectively within the existing practices in the field and how the rules might be modified. Okay, so now you are practicing, let's say for 5-10 years you are doing. Now you feel that yes, for instance, even in the cricket now, the kind of the mode of game has drastically changed. Earlier the 50 overs game is now a 20 over game. So obviously there are a set of modifications which you are imposing. That is only coming through a practice, and it is your learning. And why you are making these changes? You are basically accommodating yourself. And similarly, if I say football, so obviously a football have a different field. It has his targets of the goals, and in both the cases the rules differ. So just imagine now the same person, if you make them to play football, is it easy for him to swift the change drastically? So obviously, of course, in the real life we have the multi-talented play both football and cricket, but obviously the rules and the conditions are different. He cannot play the same way as he was playing cricket in the football match. So that is the same thing. We as when we are accommodating ourselves within the field to our needs, and which are changing every day, and we are trying to set up our own rules so that we can abide with that. And that's he referring to the games, what kind of. And now what happens in the previous slide, we talked about suddenly we change the game from a cricket to a football. The rules are different, the context is different, the player has a difficulty in understanding it. Maybe a new player will have a greater difficulty in understanding how this particular game has to be achieved. So I'll tell you an example. John Friedman, he refers this thing called second birth. When we are forced or may enter another field, than one which we are at home. Imagine a cricket player, a famous cricket player, Sachin Tendulkar. If the Indian government, if he assigns them to play football and sent him for the Olympics match, obviously he will have a little difficulty. He may not able to compete with the regular football players. Maybe he will have a little difficulty because his expertise in that. He's used to that such practices. So similarly, so when you force that, when he enters into another field, and what he has to do? He has to learn the rules of the game and a process. Is it a whole day match or is it a 90-minute match? So you need to know the new set of rules. What is your target? And who are your companions? And this is a very difficult thing. Sometimes it is very slow and it is sometimes very painful. I'll give you an example. What you see on the right hand side, now the whole world, we have a lot of refugees starting from Syria, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Iran, Iraq, and also from the South American countries in Cuba, and also the Mexican countries, and you also have some of the refugees from the African countries, and here in Bangladesh. So now, an architect from a built environment perspective, so these population living in African countries or the some of the Middle Eastern countries, when they started escaping for their survival to other countries, obviously certain refugee programs are taken up by UNHCR, and many agencies have participated in how to accommodate them, how to integrate them in the process. So for example, you can see that these shelter houses, which were actually by the IKEA refugee, the Swedish giant IKEA, the furniture giant, has given these kind of prototypes which will have, so they call it a kind of sustainable futures. But then a person lived there for all their life in a Syrian culture or in an African culture, so had a great difficulty in accommodating with these so-called sustainable houses. For instance, the way they cook, it was different. The way they socialize, it was very different. They couldn't find their neighbors. They couldn't find, though they are safe by life, but are they have any support systems? So this whole process, it is not just a home. It is about how. But if these homes, imagine if some people start adapting to it in a longer run, maybe they start defining it in a different way. I'll show you how it works. Now, I told you an example of a refugee shelter, and here I'm giving you an example of post-disaster housing. In the post-disaster housing, it is the same thing. So people, because of the impact of the disaster, they are forced to move somewhere else on a relocation program or a reconstruction program. And now in the tsunami, this is my work actually in the Tamil Nadu area in south of India. Here, after these are the houses, the co-dwelling units, which were given by the agencies to the fishermen communities. Now, in these fishermen, of course, they are very permanent in nature. They are constructed with brick and concrete. They are very durable. And what kind of allocation process they have followed? And when they started asking about what kind of houses do you want, and everyone have asked for brick and concrete house, and there's a good communication thing, and then that is what exactly given to them. And now in this whole process, the joint families have broken up into nuclear families, and earlier they were all living, the mother, the father, and the elder child and the little one. Everyone used to live in one big house. But now, after the tsunami reconstruction, so people started moving to different clusters. And here you can see In the allocation process also, many of the agencies have adopted a lottery approach. So let's say a number 52, you have got a house somewhere else, and number 56, some got somewhere else. But in this case, fortunately, two brothers have got adjacent to each other. So what they did, and they have modified, they have personalized their house by their traditional form. And you can see from, it's a very interesting photograph. You can see that they have though they have these two plots, and then over the above they tried to make a very huge massive roof which actually represents a single family belonging. This is one of the very important photograph, and the agencies have given toilets. Now, in with my interactions in the fishermen communities, it was a little surprise for me when I realized that yes, these communities, some of the communities have never used the toilets in their life, and now some of them were not even aware of how to use a toilet. So this is a completely a different experience for them, because they normally use the open lands for going for a toilet. But here, when they were given a toilet, one house, I remember, the moment I entered the house, the whole house was smelling like anything. Then we just saw. I just asked them, "Why is this so smell?" They said there was a hole. So because we are a fisherman, we thought it was a dustbin. We are keeping all the fish dirt into that. So I was a little shocked that they were not even aware of this was a toilet and how to use it. So they had a great difficulty. And now what here you can see is that photograph of a toilet is converted as a place of puja room. We call it is a place of worship. So now a toilet to a puja room. So see how people have responded to it. So this is where an architects have to be sensitive about who are these beneficiaries and what are their cultural background and what are their living practices. So this is where we have to be sensitive with the local cultures. Now, there's been a lot of criticism in Bodioso. So we understand now the fields and the games and the sense of habitat, how they are making a sense of place, and the whole process is referred as a kind of habitus. Dovey refers there are some challenges because Bourdieu's concept is very well applied in different subjects, starting from the educational psychology to many other subjects. But from the built environment also, I'm just pointing it out a few criticisms from the Bourdieu. He says, it is still remain a powerful intellectual framework for understanding this field, but says it is only ever used as a basis for architectural critique and not for critical approaches to architectural practice. So it is, it is only used for kind of architectural critic purposes, but it is not used as an approach to architectural practice. So that is one of the criticism he talks. But and Roxana Watterson is again an anthropologist background. She talks. She worked a lot in the Indonesian tribes. In Bourdieu's habitus concept was most often criticized for not sufficiently addressing the conditions of change or the conscious agency of individuals in adapting to social transformations or sudden disruptions. The slide which I showed you just now is then a good example of how the change happens within the communities, how people respond to it, and especially with the sudden disruptions. And So Bourdieu's, she talks that Bourdieu's concept, it talks about how people play within it, but then how people adapt to it, how people change their habitus. So that is where it is not much well discussed. That's what she referred on. Now, Neil Leach is one of the important pioneer in this particular field, where he talks about we must locate, because I'm slightly taking you into discussion from culture and towards the built form and the architecture. So he talks about we must locate architecture as a language of forms, not only embedded within various cultural discourses, but also giving meaning by those discourses. So when we talk that architecture, how it could itself become a language, that's what Leach talks, how it could become a language of forms, not only embedded within various cultural discourses, but also giving meaning by these discourses. So how people modify certain things and how they are producing these meanings, and how these meanings are reproduced in the later generations, and how they are modified and how they are adjusted. And I would like to now bring the end of the session of this particular lecture and taking into Amos Rappaport's contribution on house, form, and culture. And this is one of the initial work where they talk about what is the relationship between a house form and the local culture, and what is a vernacular architecture, what is a primitive architecture, what is an indigenous architecture. And because in this particular, when we talk about the language of architectural forms, obviously they vary from a small scale to a monumental scale. So he brings the distinction of how we can actually define the non-pedigreed architecture, which Bernard Rodofsky calls non-pedigreed architecture. So this is one of the important work which one has to refer as a very basic subject if we have to understand the culturally responsive built environments from the built environment studies. This is one of the important contribution in the field. And so here I end my lecture, and thank you very much. In the next class, we'll be discussing about Amos Rappaport's work, and with various examples of vernacular architecture. And we basically start with the home series of Introduction to Vernacular Architecture. Thank you very much.